as he gets settled in here, I've got Peter Londa here with Tantalus. He's going to be your next presenter, so please enjoy.
Thanks, Dakota. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for allocating a few minutes of time to learn a little bit about Tantalus Systems. As Dakota referenced, my name is Pete Londa. I've got the privilege of serving as president and CEO. Not the founder of the company, was recruited in by our board of directors in 2014. Our team is headquartered up in Vancouver, British Columbia. We're on the Toronto Stock Exchange. We'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. But before I dive in, just quick show of hands. How many of you actually drive a car? Just curious. Okay, good. So we got some audience participation. Anybody have an electric vehicle yet? We have one. All right, two. So you guys are lucky winners. You'll get a prize at the end, whether you like it or not. Out of curiosity, one more question for you to make sure you can win a prize. Did you notify your electric utility when you bought the electric vehicle? Okay, good. So hence why we exist and what we're trying to accomplish. And what I'm intending to do is provide you a very brief overview of who we are. We'll talk quickly about our capitalization, and then from there dive into what we're doing and where we think opportunity exists for investors and for the utilities that we support. So at the highest level, we are a technology company that is focused on helping electric utilities modernize the distribution grid. And so if you're not too familiar with the utility industry, there's generation, there's transmission, and then there's distribution. Distribution is the power lines, the pole-top transformers, and the substations in the neighborhoods where we all live and work. And it's that distribution grid that is the mechanism for delivering power to our homes and to our businesses. Our objective and our purpose is to help turn that distribution grid into an intelligent, IoT, predictive infrastructure. We're doing that today with 270 utilities as our customer base. So we sell directly to utilities. We are B2B. Those 270 utilities, the vast majority are in the United States. We sprinkle a little bit into Canada and into the Caribbean basin. We haven't gone too much further geographically yet. Of those 270 utilities, about 240 are referred to as public power or electric cooperative utilities. It represents about 10% of the utilities across the United States today, and we add about 20 new utilities every year through our sales process. The reason why I distinguish public power and electric cooperatives, it's a big difference between the PG&Es of the world in San Francisco or Southern Cal Edison or NV Energy here in Las Vegas. Public power and electric cooperative utilities are like the city of Chattanooga in Tennessee, which owns its own distribution grid. And by definition, they are not subject to state regulations. And so when you think about the utility industry from an investment perspective, it's typically not the sexiest. A lot of investors get concerned about timing and adoption and urgency because of regulations. We are focusing the vast majority of our time on utilities that don't have those bottlenecks in terms of regulatory drivers. With that said, we also support some of the largest utilities in the United States. Pacific Gas and Electric is an example up in San Francisco, Southern Cal Edison in the LA area, PPL in Pennsylvania, to name a few. So to give you some parameters, and we'll dive deeper into all of these elements, but to give you some parameters of size, we generated $40 million last year. Even though we're on the Toronto Stock Exchange, we report in USD. So $40 million of revenue last year, 2022. It represented 23% growth year over year from 2021. Of that $40 million, we entered this calendar year, 2023, with $10 million in annual recurring revenue. It's a big area of focus. We'll talk about how we're driving that relative to what we do for the utilities. Before diving deeper into the technology and the market, we went public through a reverse merger on the TSXV in February of 2021. We raised about 10 million Canadian dollars through that financing at $2.25 a share. We then did a follow-on financing in August of 2021 of about another 10 million Canadian dollars. So in the aggregate, we raised about 20 million. All of that came in as common stock. There's no preferred stock in the cap structure, no warrants or dilutive securities. So what you see is what you get, about 44.6 million shares outstanding. I'd say we were somewhat fortunate in raising our capital before the tech sector in Canada and the United States really started to show a downward trend. So we're fully capitalized and not in the market to raise more money at this point. Covered by 4 analysts up north in Canada, and about 75% of our company is owned by institutional investors, combination of pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds, and then some of the original venture capital groups that invested in our business while we were private. So in terms of the utility industry, why are we focused on it and what are we trying to accomplish? As you may be familiar, right, utilities are under a lot of pressure today. They need to start upgrading their infrastructure. That's unfolding almost weekly, if not monthly at this point, regardless of where you live here in the US or in Canada, right? And regardless of your view of climate change, the fundamental facts are that utilities are confronted with an increasing number of extreme weather events. And where that has problems for them is it takes out infrastructure. That leads to power outages. Power outages lead to economic damage and unfortunately loss of life. It's happening in California, in Texas, through the Midwest, up in the Northeast where I live, in the New England area, certainly even the eastern provinces of Canada that witnessed a hurricane for the first time in decades. And so as those events happen, right, what does that do? It gets politicians involved. It gets consumers involved. It gets the younger generation trying to think through how we improve the environment. And that leads to calls to decarbonize the utility industry. Not only are we asking the utility industry to eliminate coal and eliminate the typical fuel sources that they've relied on, but we're simultaneously asking them to electrify everything. And what I mean by that specifically, and the reason why I asked the questions regarding electric vehicles with 2 in the room, which is not a surprising percentage in terms of adoption relative to the broader United States. Right? Think about it. The utilities have to reduce the carbon emissions from what they have relied on for over 100 years while simultaneously preparing to increase the amount of power that needs to be delivered to support the migration of transportation to electric vehicles. That's adding pressure to an aging infrastructure. In many circumstances in the United States, we see devices that are at or beyond expected life. I'll give you a specific example. If you drive down the streets in your homes when you head out of Vegas, most of this area is below ground, so you don't see things. But you'll see utility poles, wood, concrete, depending on where you live. And on the top of some of those poles, it looks like a big beer can. That big beer can is a pole-top transformer. Pole-top transformers are deployed by utilities with the view that they're typically up there for about 30 years. The average life of pole-top transformers in the United States today is 44 years. Right, so these devices are at or beyond expected life, and that infrastructure is being asked to do more things as we electrify every aspect of our life. So where do we, right, what does that mean for us? It creates a fairly substantial opportunity that we are aggressively pursuing every day with our team. This is a multi-billion-dollar initiative, both in terms of legacy infrastructure and some new R&D that we are bringing to market. The urgency for utilities is, right, they're trying to prepare for doubling the amount of electricity consumed by 2050. You could think about that as really far away. The chances of us being here in this room by 2050, not so much. But for a utility industry to prepare for that, the investments start now. And so to that end, regardless of your views of Washington, D.C., they are throwing a significant amount of money at the utility industry to move. And to that end, we are actively engaged and pursuing 8 legislated programs that in the aggregate represent over $400 billion for the utility industry where our technology is an allowable use. And we're getting more and more active in submitting applications with the utilities that we support as well as prospective utilities that are looking to leverage our technology. So what is it and what do we do? When we talk about modernizing the distribution grid, it's really about digitizing every device that the utilities deploy, from the substation down to where we live, meters on the side of our home. And so the way we're doing that is we are bringing forward and developing and delivering an edge computing module. To give you some sense of size and scale, this is what it actually is in my hand. More than happy to do show and tell later today. This device is very much like the guts of your iPhone. And so it has a custom ASIC chip, or that little silver guy there, which has RAM and flash memory, embedded software for purposes of accessing, analyzing, and figuring out what to do with all the data we collect. It has backup power, power supplies. It has communications capability. This device ultimately gets integrated into a variety, or our edge computing module gets integrated into a variety of different devices that utilities deploy every day. Now, we don't build electric meters, but a lot of the utilities that we support are taking our edge computers and they're putting them into residential and commercial and industrial meters. We partner with 3 of the largest meter manufacturers today, Itron, Landis+Gyr, and a company called Aclara, which is owned by Hubble. Our intelligence also goes to networking infrastructure that utilities rely on. It gets embedded in a modem that's deployed inside equipment inside a substation. It's embedded in line sensors that are helping utilities figure out where they have faults or where they need to clear issues to mitigate outages or rolling blackouts. It gets integrated into load control switches, which are devices that utilities use to have more granular control at the edge of the grid. And it gets integrated into things like streetlight controllers as municipalities and communities are migrating streetlights to LED fixtures to reduce energy consumption and certainly reduce maintenance. So the reason why we build this edge computing capability and work with a variety of different vendors to integrate it into their end products, so you can think of us kind of like the intelligence inside, right? It's really about accessing data. That data ties to consumption patterns, quality metrics like voltage and current, and from there harmonics and wavelength. And I won't get into the physics of how power is delivered, right? But utilities are very focused on what is the quality of power that actually hits every asset that they have, because changes in power quality can manipulate or impact the life expectancy of devices. And so some of you may have witnessed this. You may have seen like your refrigerator or a TV, all of a sudden it doesn't turn on. Right? Sometimes that's just the age of the device that you have. But in some circumstances, it's also tied to changes in power quality at the edge of your meter, impacting voltage and current that come into the appliances that we use religiously. Right? And so another example of that is you may notice, or you may in your office buildings or your homes, you may notice when your lights flicker. Right? Sometimes that happens when your air conditioning comes on. That's a momentary change in voltage. It's a momentary outage of power. Most appliances that we have in our home have some form of backup power to mitigate those microsecond interruptions, right? But what we're doing for utilities is we're pinpointing every place they have that microsecond interruption or change in voltage and current. From that data that we collect from the devices we have in the field, over 3 million today, we're gathering about 35 billion data points a year across the 270 utilities that we support. And we're running all of that data through enterprise software applications that are used widely across the utility, everything from system planning to executives to customer service to field support. That software is telling them where devices are stressing, where they are having issues, where they may have outages, ultimately try to mitigate those disruptions. And then if there is a disruption, how to restore power quickly. And as we advance and spend money in R&D, we're driving to an increased number of AI-enabled analytics, far right-hand side, that we've just started to introduce into our market and our customer base on a SaaS-based offering. Those analytics are tied to where precisely a pole top transformer is overheating that can lead to coils breaking down, and from coils breaking down, a failure. If you live in California, right, and you're up in the Bay Area, you'll know that PG&E, in many circumstances, has been responsible for wildfires. Some of those wildfires have triggered because a pole top transformer has exploded. Right? It's a mushroom-shaped type explosion. They're loud. And if you have drought, although atmospheric rain took care of that for a good portion of California so far in 2023, right? But when you have drought, you have dry brush underneath and you get a fire on a utility pole, right? That's a real liability for utilities. So that's a problem that we're working to solve. I'll give you another example of how we capture momentary outages. Does anybody have squirrels in their neighborhood? I live in Connecticut, so we get a lot of thanks to Deb. I appreciate and Dakota, thanks for volunteering to participate here and help me out. So, right, we have a lot of squirrels. I live in Connecticut. Like clockwork, my dogs start going bananas. I don't need a alarm clock anymore because the squirrels start coming out and the dogs go, ballistic to try to trace them down. Mind you, I don't think my dogs are smart enough to figure out how to catch them. But what do squirrels do, right? They're creatures that are constantly looking to store their food, and where they remember where they find the nuts and where they put the nuts, they're not so smart in that they climb on power lines. Those power lines generate heat. As the insulation breaks down, it gets hotter. Squirrels think that's a nut. And so what do? They start chipping away at the insulation. And they chip and they chip and they chip. And every time they chip, it's a momentary outage that gets sent down the line to other equipment, including meters. And so with the intelligence that we're putting out into the field, we can capture by endpoint where those momentary outages are happening and help the utility figure out where do they have impact on insulation. That also happens with tree vegetation. So where I live in Connecticut, where we've had a lot of storms, Eversource is the utility that supports my home and where my office is located, and they have a war on trees. They're just hacking away at trees left and right, to mitigate tree branches from hitting those power lines. So what we like to say is if you don't understand what the hell I'm talking about and you don't remember anything about us, you can remember that there is one company here at this conference that is gathering data and running analytics to help utilities pinpoint where these little squirrels are chewing away at the insulation. And when they ultimately break through that insulation, it means squirrels electrocuted, dies, drops on the ground. More importantly, it triggers a power outage. And if you research squirrels and power outages, you'll see up in BC, British Columbia, not too far from where our headquarters are, a squirrel bit into a large power line. Poor squirrel died. 9,000 people lost power for days. And so I like to say we're trying to save little squirrels one at a time. So for the two of you that had the EVs, you're going to go home with a little squirrel. And like I said, if you don't remember anything about us, you can remember, if you invest in us, you'd help save the squirrels. So that's what we're doing. A lot of this focus ties to helping utilities focus on where their traditional area of responsibility has been in the distribution grid, which is the substation down to the meter where we live. And so our devices, are, as I mentioned, they're in the substation, pole top transformers, into meters. About 2 years ago, part of the reason why we went public, we got approached by a number of the utilities in our user community that started to see an increasing adoption of electric vehicles show up on their grid. And as an electric vehicle shows up, that means incremental power that needs to be delivered at different times of the day and in different locations. And so utilities started stressing about what does that mean for the meter socket, overheating, potential meter fire? What does it mean for the power lines where squirrels are chipping away at the insulation? Increased risk. What does it mean for pole top transformers? It cascades. And so what utilities approached us about, existing customers, when we think about voice of the customer, was how do they truly get behind the meter to control and have visibility into an incremental number of devices that people across the United States, Canada, Europe are deploying, whether that's the purchase of an electric vehicle with a charger, inverters for rooftop solar, for power walls, a backup generator, a smart hot water heater, an upgraded electric panel that has some form of communication. The appliance companies, GE Appliance is an example, they're doing everything they can to put intelligent appliances in our home where we download an app that we then subscribe to figure out what's happening with the appliance that we've got. And so utilities are under duress as things change behind the meter. So what we've been working on from an R&D perspective, and if you see some of the history of our company or you track us moving forward, you'll see a lot of information around this device. It's called the TrueSense Gateway. And what this device does is you'll kind of see a little bit hard here, same custom ASIC system on chip, a bunch of coils for existing meters to plug right into. So we're retrofitting existing infrastructure. We capture a ton of power quality that historically has only been done at the substation. And we've included Wi-Fi and PLC capabilities so that the utility can send its own communication through the meter into the home to connect to devices like an EV charger. The reason why they're doing that is to try to provide us as consumers with incentives, reduced rate structures, improved reliability, identifying where we may have issues inside our home. And so the goal here is really to access that much more data, leverage our existing enterprise software and AI capabilities, and help the utility not only modernize to the meter, but more importantly, extend the edge of the grid all the way down to the EV chargers to mitigate imbalances between supply and demand, improve their reliability and resiliency. What that means in terms of opportunity, I'll accelerate this quickly, but we've mapped out beyond the opportunity that's a multi-billion-dollar effort for our existing capabilities from the substation to the meter. Helping utilities get behind the meter represents, over the next 5 years, about an identified 19 million endpoints for us to retrofit existing infrastructure that utilities rely upon. That translates into about $9.5 billion of incremental revenue opportunity for us to pursue. And so as a smaller company at $40 million of revenue, how do we actually do that in a digestible and reasonable manner? Of that roughly $9.5 billion, we are actively engaged with utilities through sales processes that represents about $1 billion of identified opportunity. Of that $1 billion, we built an advisory committee to help us ultimately bring this new product, the TrueSense Gateway, into market. And so that advisory committee is 8 utilities that represent about $200 million of incremental revenue for us, in addition to the growth that we already have from our existing capabilities. In terms of bringing that into market, we've shared this through our earnings presentations. We'll continue to report on it. We are through field alpha trials. We are in what's called UL certification. We expect that to be completed this summer with field trials rolling out in Q3, commercial and available for sale at the end of this calendar year. So we won't see a lot of revenue from this product this calendar year, but we will see orders. In terms of our financial profile, publicly available, you'll see we got impacted by COVID, from COVID to supply chain constraints as we build little edge computers, from supply chain constraints to inflation, so sort of the big three that impacted revenue in 2020 and 2021. But we're getting back to where we were pre-COVID at almost $40 million of revenue last year. As I had mentioned, of that 40, 13 million is from software and services. Of that 13 million, 10 million is now annual recurring revenue. And we're seeing that grow quite nicely since 2016 at just under 20% compounded annual growth rate. And the model is convince more utilities to get our devices in the field, collect that data, monetize that data through software and analytics as we go. I say that our devices are in the field for 12 to 15 years. And so we're locking into a very long, sticky relationship with utilities to drive that annual recurring revenue again and again. On average, we get about $100 per endpoint per edge computer upfront. That's what we get paid by the utility. And then they are locking into about a $4 revenue per connected device per year for the next 12 to 15 years. In terms of how we think about executing on the opportunity that's in front of us, we've assembled a management team that has over 200 years of collective experience selling into and supporting electric utilities. I'd note that our board of directors is a group of 5, 4 of whom are independent. I'm the 5th director. Our chair is a woman named Laura Formusa, who was CEO of Hydro One of the largest electric utilities in North America, certainly in Canada. So we think we've got the right team in place with a robust opportunity with new technology and a great core business that provides a lot of downside protection for new investors to move into our stock to the extent that you're interested. With that, I don't know if we have any time for Q&A, but a few minutes or no? Yeah, about a minute. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so question is, speaking to competition, I'll make everybody nauseous by flipping slides really quickly here. So we run into a combination of different types of competitors, some small companies like us. We partner and compete with some of the larger meter manufacturers like Itron and Landis+Gyr. As we get more into analytics, we're running into private company OATI and the likes of Oracle, who has a utility division embedded into their larger organization. Mind you, our infrastructure today relies on Oracle. We haven't migrated to Amazon just yet. So in many circumstances, we're partnering and running with sharp elbows across a couple of organizations that are much bigger in scale. From my perspective, and being in this industry since 2008, I ran a private company in this space. Rather than going public, we ultimately made progress and had Morgan Stanley advise us on a trade sale. Our industry is ripe for consolidation, so our goal is to continue to try to scale the business and then let the circumstances unfold the way they unfold as we have a first mover advantage on some of our technology and are gaining skill. Thanks for the question. Appreciate everybody's time. Pleasure to see you. Hope we connect.